nothing happens which is final in the sense that it is not part of any ongoing stream of events. And therefore, ends are in fact literally endless, forever coming into existence as new activities occasion new consequences. So, I mean, this speaks to the important point that we can't ever think about the ends of our actions. We have to think about the effect that our actions will have going on into the future. And this is something that theorists of revolution and proponents of violence often ignore. And what it means is that the outcomes of all political actions are already prefigured in, or an extension of, the means employed to achieve them. So as Gandhi famously put it, to argue that the means of revolution can be viewed as separate from the ends of revolution is like saying, and I quote, that we can get a rose through planting a noxious weed. The means may be likened to the seed, the end to the tree. And there is just the same and viable connection between the means and the ends as there is between the seed and the tree. We reap exactly what we sow. That's just one way of thinking about this. Another way is to look at it through structuration theory or constitutive theory, and to look at the ways in which violence is constitutive of social structures, actors, identities, practices, and society at large. I mean, at the very simplest level, we have to acknowledge that even using organized violence cannot occur without the prior construction of what some have referred to as the war system. And the war system has to provide institutional arrangements for the scientific development of weapons and military strategies, a political economic system for the production and disbursement of weapons and war materials, a logistical system for the training and material support of military personnel, a medical care system for the psychological and physical well-being of the troops, a system of doctrines, laws, and norms governing the use of deadly force, a violence-supporting culture, the memorialization of those who die, accepted public narratives which define the identities of friends and enemies, worthy and unworthy victims, threats and dangers, and so on. In other words, in order to be able to use violence as a tool in your political project, whether it's revolution or war or humanitarian intervention, first of all requires constructing a huge material, social, and discursive system. Now, these systems have inherent values, norms, and expectations. They help to constitute the nature of society that has them. However, I think this critical analysis can be extended even further. Bloom, for example, makes the important point, drawing on Foucault, that there is a mutually constituting relationship between power and resistance, in which power and resistance mutually produce each other and ourselves as social subjects. Power is constructed in and from its relation to the resistance that seeks to transform it. In other words, we could say violent power produces violent resistance, which in turn reproduces violent power. Certainly, it's difficult to see how violent resistance could mutually constitute an opposite type of peaceful power for that which it seeks to resist. Peter Bloom goes on to argue that, importantly, discursive hegemony has a strong affective component. A dominant discourse psychologically grips subjects according to its constructed desires. So what this means is, without being reductive or deterministic, we have to take into account how the dominant discourse of power and resistance that Bloom describes affects the revolutionary subject. And it may help us to explain how the desire for revolutionary counterviolence of the kind advocated by Fanon is produced in the oppressed subject and those who want to help them, because power produces specific types of resistance and specific types of resistant subjects. In a second step, then, what what we're trying to argue here is that the kind of resistance we undertake sets the scope and limits of its politics and possibilities. In other words, the kind of resistance we're trying to use will limit the type of society, the type of politics, the type of relationships, the type of subjectivity, the type of agents that comes out of this. And so what we're arguing is that if you use violent forms of resistance, you kind of limit the kind of social possibilities for the type of revolutionary society that comes out of it. And in a way, it could be argued that the commitment to use revolutionary violence is a kind of forceful conservatism and a reification of violently oppressive power in the world today, because it reproduces the dominant mode of power. I mean, in part, this explains why pacifists such as Gandhi and Tolstoy were deeply suspicious of the crude instrumentalism of Marxism, which assumed that the state could be violently captured and then used simply as a tool for revolutionary transformation. Instead, they understood that the state's very mode of sovereign power, as elucidated by Benjamin, Agamben, and others, was violent, and therefore could not be anything but constitutive of a violent, oppressive order. So they argued for the dissolution of the state and its replacement with self-organizing communities committed to radically non-violent politics. So that's the first argument that we have to confront, or that the proponents of violent revolution have to confront, is that violence is not a neutral tool that you can simply pick up and use, but it's actually, first of all, in a way, constituted by the power that you're opposing, but also constitutive of the kind of revolution that you're going to produce afterwards. And it's constitutive at both, I think, a collective level and a political level, but also at an individual level. It constitutes the type of revolutionary subject that practices it. And in a way, that's because violence is an embodied experience. And then also, it kind of sets the limits of the social possibilities for the type of society that comes after it. And in many ways, the argument would be that so many of the world's violent revolutions that we've seen over history have ended up reproducing a violent, oppressive state because that's the natural consequence of the constitutive nature of using this form of political action. But I want to make another argument here as well, and that is that violence is the antithesis of politics. So following one strand of political theory, it can be argued that violence is the opposite of politics. It's the constitutive outside of politics. It sets the limits of politics. And we can think about this by looking at the essential characteristics of violence. So the characteristics of violence are the opposite, or the negation of the characteristics of politics. For example, violence treats people as a means to an end, while politics treats people as ends in themselves. Violence is dominatory and unilateral action, while politics is cooperative and consensual. Violence is certain, final, and irreversible, while politics is open-ended, experimental, and provides for reconsideration and reversibility. Violence is antagonistic, while politics is agonistic. Violence destroys the public sphere and democratic space, while politics empowers the public sphere and democratic debate, and so on and so forth. So from this perspective, it can be argued, and I'm quoting Fraser and Hutchings here, that regardless of whether violence may have its uses and justifications in relation to politics, the crucial point is that it should never be conflated with politics itself. Politics is conceptually and theoretically distinct from violence. The key point is that the inherent nature of violence makes it difficult to argue that the employment of violence as a form of political contestation or resistance could ever function to constitute a new kind of politics. A kind of politics based on peace, justice, liberation, non-domination, equality, would seem that a normative, dialogic, emancipatory form of politics requires the use of means compatible with the same ends. And a form of resistance that was capable of constituting a peaceful form of politics free from oppressive power requires that the ends and the means are consistent. So, just in conclusion, what I've tried to do here is subject some frequently heard arguments about the necessity of violence in liberating oppressed people to critical examination. And I tried to raise some doubts about the potential for violent resistance as a mode of political action and the basis for revolutionary transformation. As a consequence, and again following Bloom, I suggest that rather than the tired and somewhat pessimistic call for violent revolution to overthrow the capitalist, colonial, oppressive, neoliberal state, what is urgently needed, and I quote, in the present, are fresh and more effective forms of expanding social possibilities past prevailing power regimes and norms. We need to foster multiplicity and new ways of pushing beyond the existing limits of what is currently socially possible. And I'm arguing here that getting beyond social limits is not possible using the same old practices of domination and control that are inherent to the use of violent resistance. Instead, it requires a new kind of revolutionary politics and a new kind of revolutionary subjectivity, one that revolutionizes both the means and the ends of politics in order to escape the stagnant fate of permanent revolution. In other words, as Bloom puts it, we need to revolutionize revolution. This requires accepting the notion that revolution is needed to capture power in order to abolish power, and accepting that that notion has failed. And instead, what we require is to reimagine revolution as the dissolution of current forms and practices of power. In other words, we don't need a theory of revolution about capturing power, we need a theory of revolution about dissolving current forms of power and replacing them in an experimental way with alternative types of relationships of power of the kind that Stalin talked about on the first day of the conference in relation to the Zapatistas, forming new kinds of relationships, new kinds of subjectivities, new forms of governance, new ways of doing politics and of being in the world. Now, in a way, this implies that we have to also rethink what at the moment is the dominant form of what we might call pragmatic or instrumentalist nonviolence. Given that much of that action is actually aimed at perhaps reforming the current system but not transforming its underlying modes of politics and ways of being. So as O'Halloran argues, instead we need to think about revolutionary action as that which inaugurates new concepts of political action and the human. So from this perspective, kind of reformist nonviolence can't be genuinely revolutionary because it reifies the existing political order and its modalities of sovereign power. And that's also true, as I've tried to argue, for violent revolution as well. It seems to me that only radical forms of nonviolence, such as pacifism or Gandhianism, provide such revolutionary potential. Now, fortunately, you might say, well, this is all very well in theory, but does it work in practice? I mean, as I've alluded to and as others have documented, history and the current international scene provides numerous examples of large-scale and small-scale social movements who are practicing a new kind of revolutionary, emancipatory, non-violent kind of politics. And they have a vision to build a more peaceful and just world. Crucially, as Peter Bloom once again notes, and I quote, these contemporary movements point the way towards a new politics that does not just resist the existing social order, but reinvents it. And he gives the example of it's the possibility to try and imagine, or the evolution of protests against police abuse into a deeper imagining of how to construct a society that does not need to be policed. Now, such movements are frequently based on a non-violent or pacifist political project and rooted in the recognition of the other, the acceptance of radical difference and radical human interdependence, and the impossibility of certainty or absolute truth. At the same time, and this is my concluding point, we have to acknowledge the current limits of non-violent or pacifist politics and recognize that it's still in the process of invention, as Barbara Deming put it. Dallinger makes the point, and I quote, "The theory and practice of active non-violence are roughly at the stage of development today as those of electricity in the early days of Marconi and Edison. A new source of power has been discovered and crudely utilized in certain specialized situations, but our experience is so limited and our knowledge so primitive that there is a legitimate dispute about its applicability to a wide range of complicated and critical tasks." In other words, we still have a long way to go to realize the effective force and transformative power of pacifism and nonviolence. I mean, in part, this is because we haven't invested the intellectual and material resources in it comparable to those invested in violence. I mean, Robert Holmes makes the really interesting and ironic point that, and I quote, "No one can foresee what the results might be if a country like the United States were to spend $300 billion a year in research on techniques of nonviolent resistance and on educating and training people in their use," which I think is an excellent point. Nevertheless, on the basis of the theory and evidence that we do have, we can be quite sure that only a resistance and a politics based on radical nonviolence can be genuinely revolutionary. As Chabot and Sharifi state at the end of their study on the Arab Spring, and I quote, "We conclude that revolutionaries who recognize the pervasive dangers of imperiality and tentacles of violence are more likely to make other worlds possible by experimenting with Gandhian self-rule, truth-seeking, and non-violence in their everyday lives and local communities." So the recovery, I think, of a kind of Gandhian realism as the basis for politics and resistance today, together with concepts like Satyagraha and with thinking about Gandhi's constructive program, is a kind of moral and strategic imperative.